Can loyalty survive when the crown forgets your name? In the shadow of a modernizing monarchy, Prince Edward finds himself quietly erased until his brother King Charles III pushes too far. Unfolds a gripping tale of rivalry, legacy, and unspoken wounds. As the institution tightens around image and control, Edward fights not for power, but for the right to be remembered in his own way. Windsor Castle, March 10th, 2023. The applause rose soft and ceremonial, then faded just as quickly as it had begun. In the high-ceilinged ballroom of Windsor Castle, under the golden glow of crystal chandeliers, Prince Edward stood still, freshly titled as the Duke of Edinburgh. The weight of the moment should have felt triumphant. Instead, it felt staged, distant, practiced. Across the room, officials in tailcoats clapped politely, cameras flashed, and a few royal watchers scribbled notes with the air of ticking off a formal obligation. But Edward's eyes weren't on the crowd. He glanced at the two empty chairs near the front, reserved untouched. Charles and William. Not even a pre-recorded message, just their absence. He folded the page of his speech with mechanical precision. "It is with humility that I accept this title in memory of my father's unwavering service," he had said. The applause had come just as it was meant to, and now it was gone. Sophie joined him near the dais, offering a calm, familiar smile. "You were dignified, exactly what they hoped for." "I wasn't hoping to be dignified," Edward replied. "I was hoping to feel something." She touched his hand briefly. "That will come later." But he wasn't sure it would. Later, during the reception in St. George's Hall, the air was thick with champagne and controlled small talk. Edward moved through the guests like a man fulfilling a checklist, shaking hands, offering smiles, nodding at compliments he couldn't remember. "Did you see the King and William at Davos?" a guest murmured behind him. "Incredible. Visionary leadership." Edward paused at a silver tray, picked up a glass. He didn't turn around. "You look like you're somewhere else," Anne said, sliding beside him. She wore her uniform sense of purpose like armor. "I was just wondering when someone might mention the actual ceremony we were at today," Edward said. "They won't. You know that. Shouldn't I matter just a little?" Anne's voice softened only slightly. "You do, just not to them." By nightfall, he was back at Bagshot Park, seated in his study, as rain tapped lightly against the window. The fire burned low. On his desk sat an envelope bearing the royal seal. He opened it with little interest. "Edward, congratulations on assuming the title of Duke of Edinburgh. Your continued dedication to service is appreciated. Charles R." He read it twice, not out of emotion but disbelief at how impersonal it was. Near the edge of his desk sat a photo, he and Philip in a canoe, soaked and grinning. He remembered that day vividly: wine, water, Philip's barking orders, and his own quiet triumph when they'd reached the shore first. "You said legacy was earned, not gifted," Edward muttered. "But what happens when no one notices you've earned it?" The room offered no answer. He stepped into the garden, the chill of March biting through his sleeves. Windsor glowed on the horizon like a memory just out of reach. The grass was damp, the air clean. He looked up into the black sky, stars scattered like a crown undone. "You should have been here, Father," he whispered. Then he stood in silence, the new Duke of Edinburgh, waiting for the applause that would never come. Davos, Switzerland, March 11th, 2023. The snow fell softly against the windows of the Grand Hotel Belvedere, blanketing the peaks in a quiet majesty that Charles found both soothing and suffocating. Inside, the lights were blinding. The stage hummed with applause. He stood beside William, cameras capturing the moment as they concluded their panel on climate leadership. Reporters described it as a landmark generational image, a father and son united in purpose, forward-looking, future-bound. Charles nodded politely through the final handshakes. His speech, crafted over weeks, had gone precisely as intended. He spoke of planetary duty, sustainable sovereignty, and legacy, not of blood, but of breath. They lapped it up. But beneath the suit, beneath the sovereign calm, his chest ached, not emotionally. Physically, he didn't show it. Later, in the private lounge set aside for royals and dignitaries, Charles sat across from William and three of his senior advisors. The snow outside made the world feel distant. William leaned forward. They were impressed. "You held the room." Charles allowed a tired smile. "We must remind them we still know how." An aide opened a folder. There's a matter requiring immediate decision. Budgetary reallocation. Charles raised an eyebrow. The Green Crown Initiative needs a larger digital team. We propose redirecting funds from secondary outreach programs, specifically the Duke of Edinburgh. Award extension your brother proposed last quarter. Charles exhaled. Of course, another aide added. It's not a full cut, just a redirection, but it will delay his plans. William looked uncertain. He's worked on that for years. Charles responded quietly. The world is moving forward. He's welcome to join it. There was a pause. Someone murmured. He won't take it quietly. Charles closed the folder. Edward never takes anything loudly. That's the problem. He stood, the fatigue behind his eyes growing heavier by the minute. Do it? That evening he called Anne. She answered in 2 rings. I was wondering when you'd bother. Charles ignored the jab. Did it go well, Edward's ceremony? It did. You should have seen it. A silence followed. I was indisposed, Charles said too quickly. Anne didn't press. Instead, she shifted. Andrew's security is bleeding through the press again. Charles rubbed his temple. I've already handled it. No, you've postponed it. There's a difference. He stared out the window. It's never simple with family. Anne's voice cooled. You make it more complicated by pretending it isn't. He didn't answer. Alone in his suite, Charles unbuttoned his shirt and stood before the mirror. His shoulders drooped slightly when no one watched. He looked older than he felt, not tired, drained. He opened a drawer, removed a vial, and swallowed a single white pill. The snow had grown heavier. The world outside was smothered in white. On his phone, a photo of Edward at Windsor appeared in his news feed, standing with Sophie, smiling faintly. The headline read, Quiet Royal, Quiet Honor. Charles stared at it. He neither smiled nor frowned. He simply clicked the screen dark. He stood by the window, the Alps beyond veiled in fog and silence. They all want a king who forgets he was once a brother. He murmured. The snow did not respond. Neither did the crown. Chapter 3. Ghosts in the Hall. Late March 2023. The letter arrived in the Morning Post, thick with formality, sealed in the colorless language of royal bureaucracy. Edward read it twice. The expansion of the Duke of Edinburgh Award will be reviewed for consolidation under the existing Green Crown Initiative. Operational oversight to be assigned to the Prince of Wales's office with intent to streamline public engagement. He set the letter down carefully, though every line in his body tensed. Sophie stood across the room watching. They've handed it to William, he said, voice quiet. Her brow furrowed. He wouldn't have asked for it. I know, Edward replied. That's the worst part. It wasn't William's doing. It was Charles's signature at the bottom. Charles's idea of streamlining, which in practice meant repackaging something meaningful into something modern, branded efficient, and entirely detached from the man who started it, from the man who gave it to Edward. He arrived at Buckingham Palace an hour early for a scheduled meeting, more out of instinct than intention. The staff let him in with the same smiles they'd given him since childhood, unchanged yet somehow colder now. The palace was too quiet, hollowed. He walked slowly through the corridors past portraits of dead monarchs and forgotten cousins until he reached the older wing, unused offices, locked sitting rooms, heritage more dusted than honored. He stopped in front of the old trophy hall, now dimly lit. A single bronze plaque caught his eye, Duke of Edinburgh Award. Founded 1956, in service of challenge and character. It was crooked. A layer of dust veiled its engraving, forgotten like the rest of the hallway. He stared at it. A memory surfaced, Philip's voice in that sharp, clipped way. No fanfare, no shortcuts. Service is what you do when no one's looking. Edward had believed that once. But what did it matter now? He didn't hear Anne approach until she stood beside him, arms crossed. I thought I'd find you here. He didn't look at her. Do you think he knows what he's done? Yes, she said. But he believes it's right. Edward shook his head. He could have told me, at least that. He avoids what he can't control. I'm not asking to control any. No, Anne replied. You're asking to be seen. He finally turned to face her. And you think that's selfish? She didn't answer right away. I think it's human. Silence passed between them, thick as the air in the hall. He's breaking everything into neat pieces, Edward said. Reputation here, modernity there, family somewhere at the bottom. Anne exhaled. And yet you're still here. For now. That night back at Bagshot, Edward entered the one place he hadn't touched since the funeral Philip's study. It was just as it had been. Leather-bound books, maps, pens aligned like soldiers. A half-used notepad sat beneath a paperweight bearing the family crest. Edward sat. He opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a folder labeled Legacy Projects, 2009. Inside was an old speech his father had drafted but never delivered. Words underlined in blue ink: legacy is not ceremony, it is continuity. It is a quiet thread running through the noise of power. Edward closed the folder. He looked around the study at the books, the silence, the shadows. Then he picked up his father's old fountain pen and set a blank sheet in front of him. Not for Charles, not for revenge, but because the one thing that still mattered was refusing to be erased. He began to write. Buckingham Palace, April 2024. The red drawing room smelled faintly of polished wood and the memory of power. Prince Edward sat quietly at the far end of the long mahogany table, hands folded, expression unreadable. Across from him, Charles flipped through briefing papers as if they were matters of routine, not family. Consolidation is necessary, Charles said without looking up. We can no longer stretch ourselves thin across outdated engagements. William's initiatives must take priority in the new budget cycle. Edward tilted his head. And my work is what peripheral. It's not personal, Edward. It's practical. Edward's fingers twitched. Funny how practical always seems to mean less, Edward. Charles paused, the tension behind his eyes briefly visible. He gestured to an aide to step out. William had already excused himself, too diplomatic to stay, too silent to speak. Anne remained arms crossed, watching. What exactly are you suggesting? Charles asked evenly. Edward leaned forward. I'm suggesting you've made a habit of treating legacy like a spreadsheet. You cut programs, you bury patronages, and you think replacing Philip's life's work with PR-friendly banners makes us look modern. It doesn't. It makes us look rootless. Charles's voice lowered. Your program is being merged, not erased, and yet you fund Andrew's security quietly, without scrutiny, without reduction. The silence that followed was ice cracking under pressure. That is not relevant, Charles said flatly. It's completely relevant. You'll gut public service programs, but you'll preserve the shadow that shames us all. Why? Because you're afraid of what'll surface if you don't. Charles rose, slow and deliberate. Andrew is still our brother, and so am I, Edward snapped. Or had you forgotten? Anne stepped in. Enough, both of you. But neither man moved. You think wearing the crown gives you moral clarity, Edward said, voice quieter, now sharper. But it's made you blind, Charles. You talk of vision, but I see a man terrified of anything that doesn't reflect him. Charles's hands tightened behind his back. Do not mistake my restraint for indifference. No, Edward said. You've made it very clear you're indifferent. That's the problem. The meeting adjourned with stiff silence. Anne left first, muttering something about needing air. Charles walked ahead through the hallway without looking back. Edward followed. When they reached the corridor just beyond the portrait gallery, Charles turned. No aides, no siblings, no cameras. Why are you really here, Edward? I wanted to hear it from you. I wanted to see if you still recognized what family looks like. I gave you freedom. I gave you trust. You gave me silence, Edward said. You gave me shadows. Charles's jaw clenched. You think you've been overlooked. You've been protected. Edward stepped closer. From what? From relevance. Charles's voice was cold now. Don't take this public. Edward didn't flinch. You already did. You just thought I wouldn't notice. They stared at each other, two sons of the same father raised in different cages. Then Charles turned away. Edward exited through the palace's side entrance, avoiding the waiting press. They weren't there for him. They never were. He walked through the side garden as the sun lowered behind the palace. The wind tugged gently at his coat. No cameras, no headlines. He turned back once, eyes lingering on the walls behind which he had been raised and left behind. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like part of it. He felt free. Mid-May 2024, The newspapers had given Edward exactly what he hadn't asked for: attention. Charles sat in his study at Clarence House, a spread of broadsheets fanned before him. Legacy at a Crossroads, one read. Another Prince Edward, the quiet voice of tradition. The article didn't mention Charles by name, but the implication was clear. Edward had given a speech at a modest charity function in Leeds, speaking of continuity over spectacle of service beyond strategy. The press had turned it into a referendum on the monarchy's future. He folded the paper neatly. Ignore it, he told his aide. But he didn't. Later in the garden, William walked beside him. The sun was out, but Charles felt the weight of every step. He's not trying to undermine you, William said gently. I know. Then why does it bother you? Charles stopped walking. Because it works. William looked at him, brow furrowed. Maybe there's room for both visions. Yours and his. There isn't, Charles snapped, then softened. There never has been. Not for me. William hesitated. You're not your father. No, I'm the one who couldn't afford to be. They said little after that, but Charles knew William was thinking it too. The crown was becoming heavier, and it would not wait. That night Charles dreamed of Balmoral, of rain on the windows, of his mother's voice sharp behind a closed door. He must learn, he'll be king one day. He cannot afford softness. He had been 12. Crying in a hallway after disappointing her during a public appearance, he'd tripped over his lines at a ceremony, tears welling in front of the cameras. Philip hadn't said a word, just handed him a handkerchief and walked away. The fatigue returned a week later at Sandringham, a subtle pressure in his chest, nothing dramatic, but enough. He met with the royal physician privately. The doctor asked careful questions, conducted quiet tests, recommended a series of scans. Charles nodded, saying little. Afterward, he walked the gardens alone as the sky threatened rain. The roses were in bloom, Elizabeth's favorite. She'd once told him a garden is like a monarchy. If you tend only the flowers, the roots rot in silence. He hadn't understood it then. He did now. He paused by a bench. A robin landed on the armrest, chirped once, and flew away. Birds don't stay in cages if they learn to sing elsewhere, she had said once. About Anne. About Edward. Perhaps about herself. Back inside, he sat at his desk. The study was quiet, save for the ticking of the clock inherited from his grandfather. A handwritten letter sat beside his briefing papers, his name written in Edward's familiar, careful script. He hadn't opened it, not because he feared what it said, because he feared it would be kind. He picked up a pen, not to respond, not to reply, but to write, in his journal on the back page. What does it mean to be a king if no one sees the man beneath? He underlined it once, then rested the pen down, and for a long moment he did nothing at all. Bagshot Park, June 2024. The letter from the palace was firm, predictable, and dismissive. Further coordination on the Duke of Edinburgh Award is advised to proceed through official channels under the Green Crown Initiative umbrella. Future branding partnerships and communications must align with central messaging protocols. Edward didn't finish reading it. He folded the letter in half, then again, and dropped it in the bin beside his desk. He looked out the window toward the garden. The rain was gentle that morning, persistent but not angry. A familiar rhythm, like the voice in his mind that had been growing stronger for months. Sophie entered quietly, carrying tea. Another polite shutdown, almost poetic this time, Edward replied. She watched him for a moment. Charles isn't your enemy, Edward. I know. He took the cup. He's just no longer my permission. Over the next 6 weeks, Edward did what he knew best. He worked, not through palace offices or curated media plans, but through handwritten letters, phone calls to old friends of his father, and partnerships that had existed before branding overtook meaning. He visited a youth center in Glasgow, where 2 of the original Duke of Edinburgh Award coordinators had quietly maintained their program without official funding. He toured a vocational school in Kenya, where the walls still bore faded photographs of Philip standing beside a line of students in the 1990s. He attended a small gathering in Toronto where alumni of the program recited their personal milestones with more pride than polish. There were no press pools, no media strategies, but the word spread anyway. The first article came from a local paper in Edinburgh. Prince Edward quietly restores father's award, igniting grassroots momentum. Then another legacy in action, a royal working without the spotlight. Then The Guardian. As the crown looks forward, Edward walks back and finds people waiting. He didn't give interviews. He didn't need to. The story wasn't him, it was the work. At Clarence's house, the reaction was swift and silent. Charles made no public comment, but Edward's access to certain institutional grants was quietly paused. Requests for shared use of royal venues were unavailable at this time. Anne called him discreetly one afternoon. "You're winning hearts," she said, "but you're also stepping on the king's nerves." Edward exhaled. Then he knows how it feels. The only moment of real discomfort came at a Commonwealth reception in London. William found him near the gardens, away from the crowd. "I didn't ask for the award," William said. "You know that, don't you?" "I know," Edward replied. "But you didn't give it back either." William lowered his voice. "We're all trying to do our part." Edward gave a thin smile. "Then let me do mine." He walked away before it could turn into something neither of them wanted. In mid-July, at a modest youth summit in Wales, Edward gave a brief, unscripted speech. "No legacy survives because of noise," he said. "It survives because someone somewhere decides to keep it alive quietly, patiently, without needing to be noticed." The applause wasn't thunderous, but it was real. Back at Bagshot Park, Sophie found him in the study that evening, reading a stack of letters. Dozens, some type, most handwritten, piled across his desk. One letter, written in smudged blue ink, simply read, "You made us feel seen again." Edward folded it carefully, slid it into the top drawer, and reached for another envelope. The rebellion had no banners, no slogans, but it had begun. August 2024. The hallway outside the consulting room was a tunnel of silence, glass, steel, and filtered light. Charles sat alone, hands folded in his lap, listening to the steady tick of a clock mounted above the reception. He hated clocks. He hated what they reminded him of. The physician returned with soft steps and a gentle voice. "It's early, but it's real." Charles didn't move. "You'll need treatment soon. We can begin discreetly, privately." Still no reaction, only a faint nod. The word cancer was never spoken, but it echoed all the same. He rode back to Clarence's house in silence. Not even his private secretary joined him. From the back seat, he watched the city blur past London, oblivious, endless, alive. A cyclist darted through traffic. Tourists posed near St. James's. The monarchy, as always, was both omnipresent and unseen. He was the king, and in this moment he had never felt more irrelevant. Later that evening, he sat in his study, flipping absently through briefing papers. His schedule had been carefully padded with words like rest review and limited engagement. A few postponed tours. No public statement, no explanation. On the top of the pile was a tabloid front page, Edward's Empire, the Prince Reviving the Past. The photo showed his brother shaking hands at a youth center in Jamaica. No fanfare, no speeches, just presence. Charles's gaze hardened. Beneath his breath, "They never saw what I gave up to be heard." Anne arrived the next day, sharp as ever, but more watchful than usual. She didn't sit down. "You're not well," she said. "I'm tired. You're pale. I'm always pale." She crossed her arms. "Charles." He looked away. "It's under control." "So it's true," he didn't answer. Anne exhaled. "Edward's work is real and good. You should have supported it. You should still." His patience cracked. "And what was I supposed to do?" Anne apologized for leading. She didn't flinch. "No, just stop pretending you were the only one who did." She left him with that, no goodbye, no ceremony, only truth. That night at Sandringham, Charles wandered the grounds alone. The sky was low and gray, the kind of summer evening that carried the scent of autumn. He walked the paths his father once marched with him when he was barely tall enough to keep pace. He remembered Philip's brisk stride, his voice sharp with expectation. "No one waits for a king. You either lead or you vanish." He'd spent decades proving he could lead, and somewhere along the way everyone else had vanished. In the study, the lamplight was warm, gentle. A letter rested on the desk unopened since spring, Edward's handwriting on the front. He'd avoided it for weeks, not out of anger but fear. Fear it might contain something worse than accusation. Understanding. He opened it. It was short. No bitterness. Just this: "I know you carry the weight. I only ever wanted to share it." Charles closed his eyes. His hands trembled as he folded the paper. He didn't cry. Not really. But he didn't stop the tear that fell either. Later, he watched the news alone, the volume low, the screen glowing in a dark room. Edward stood before a group of young Commonwealth leaders, smiling, engaged, unpretentious. The segment ended with applause. Charles switched off the television before the reporter could add commentary. In the silence, he whispered, "He was never behind me. He was beside me." And for the first time, he meant it. London, September 2024. The invitation arrived on cream cardstock, embossed with the royal crest, impersonal and unmistakable. The king requests the presence of His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh at the Royal Foundation Gala to be held at Kensington Palace. Edward read it once, then set it down. Sophie picked it up, scanned it, and looked at him. "You should go." "I'm not sure I was invited. I think I was summoned." "Isn't that the same thing in this family?" He gave a faint smile, but it didn't last. "I don't want a headline or a gesture." "Then don't go for him," Sophie said. "Go for you." The ballroom shimmered with opulence, golden light reflecting off glass chandeliers, the soft murmur of political power dressed in tuxedos and tiaras. Edward arrived quietly, shaking hands with a few familiar faces, exchanging the kind of polite nods that suggested affection, but never promised it. Charles stood at the center of it all, slimmer, paler, dignified. If you didn't know him, you might not notice the stiffness in his movements, the fatigue behind his eyes. But Edward knew. Their eyes met across the room, a silent acknowledgement. Nothing more. When it was time for speeches, Charles took the stage. He began as expected with a prepared statement, thanking donors, dignitaries, and guests. But then he paused, folded the paper, looked out over the room. "There are those who lead from the front," he said, voice steadier than expected, "and those who lead without needing to be seen. My brother Edward has done both, quietly, constantly, and he has carried more than most will ever know." A beat of silence, then applause, soft at first, then swelling. Cameras flashed. Edward didn't move, not right away. Only when Sophie touched his arm did he blink, nod, and offer the briefest smile. Later, in one of the drawing rooms away from the crowd, Charles stood near a fireplace sipping water. Edward entered quietly. They didn't embrace. Royals didn't. Charles spoke first. "I meant what I said." Edward nodded. "I know, you've kept Father's work alive." "I never stopped," Edward replied. "I just stopped asking permission." A pause. Not awkward, just careful. Charles looked down at his glass. "I've made mistakes." Edward tilted his head. "So have I. We just made different ones." There was no apology, but something softer passed between them. They left it there. That night, back at Bagshot Park, Edward placed the gala program on the hallway table unopened. In his study, he sat beside a small pile of new correspondence. Letters from youth programs, award recipients, school principals. One from Ghana caught his eye. "We have renamed our learning center in honor of the original Duke of Edinburgh vision. Thank you for not letting it be forgotten." He folded it gently, placed it in the drawer with the others. Sophie entered with 2 glasses of wine. She sat beside him, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. "You were never invisible," she said. "You were just quieter than the rest of them." Edward didn't respond right away. He looked toward the mantel where a photo of Philip stood, weathered, unsmiling, proud. And maybe, he said, that was enough. October 2024. The letter had been tucked between 2 folders buried beneath years of estate papers. Anne found it by accident, misplaced, or perhaps intentionally hidden in a moment of old uncertainty. It was addressed in Philip's unmistakable handwriting. To Edward, for when it matters. No envelope, no wax seal, just words waiting for a moment to find meaning. She held it for a long while before deciding to deliver it. When Edward opened the door to Bagshot Park's sitting room and saw Anne standing there with the letter in hand, he didn't speak. He didn't need to. "I think," Anne said quietly, "he meant for you to have this when it mattered." He nodded once, took the paper gently, and closed the door behind her. In the solitude of his study, the fire crackling in a soft rhythm, Edward unfolded the letter. The script was firm, direct, unapologetic, just like Philip. "Edward, you were always the one who saw things clearly, the quiet one, the one who listened. I know I didn't say it often. That was never my strength. But I trusted you, not because you were loud or popular or first, but because you understood what service meant. You've always been the one to endure, not for recognition, but because you believed in the work itself. That's a legacy whether they notice it or not. You were never second. You were simply the one I trusted most. Carry it forward, quietly if that suits you, but carry it. Edward read it once. Then again. He didn't cry, but he sat there still, the letter resting on his lap like something sacred. At Sandringham, Anne poured herself a drink beside the fireplace. Charles stood behind her, arms crossed. "He got the letter?" he asked. Anne nodded. "Did you read it?" "Yes." Charles didn't speak for a long moment. Then, with something between resignation and reverence, he said, "He was the better son." Anne turned. "He was the quieter one." Charles looked into the fire. "I spent my life trying to be seen. He spent his trying not to be erased." She didn't argue. Later that night, alone in his study, Charles pulled out an old journal and ran his hand across its cover. He imagined Philip at his desk writing the letter, choosing Edward, trusting him, not with the crown, but with something older, quieter, more lasting. "I was the necessary one," Charles murmured. "He was the trusted one." It wasn't bitterness, it was truth. The following week, at a private family lunch in Windsor, Charles and Edward found themselves alone for a moment in the hallway. Neither had planned it. Charles said softly, "You received the letter." Edward met his eyes. "Yes." Charles nodded. He meant it. "I know." There was no apology, no lingering emotion, just understanding. Then with quiet finality, they rejoined the others. Back at Bagshot Park, Edward sat by the fire once more. The letter lay beside his father's fountain pen, and the first certificate of the revived Duke of Edinburgh Award dated just 6 months ago. He placed them all gently into a wooden box, closed the lid, and exhaled. Outside, the leaves had begun to fall. Orange and gold spiraled across the grass in slow, graceful arcs. Edward stepped into the garden. No applause, no titles, no expectations. Just legacy, quiet, real, and finally his own.